Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote for today. Karl Øystein Øyhaug is the Chief Financing Officer and Managing Director of Atlantic Sapphire in Homestead, Florida. Atlantic Sapphire made headlines last year for a series of incidents that have caused huge losses for the company. Karl is here to share some insights on the lessons learned from the past year and how the company hopes to move forward in transforming the future of aquaculture in America. Welcome, Karl. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jean, and the RAS Virtual Summit team for inviting us to present. As you correctly point out, we're going to start off with doing a quick presentation where we start off first with explaining a little bit about Atlantic Sapphire for those of you who are not familiar with our company from before, around 5 slides or so. Then I will talk about some of the key improvements, mainly on the risk side that we've had last year, before I turn over to an operational status update that really shows the latest and greatest on how things are going here at the world's largest land-based salmon farm in Homestead, Florida. So that's a little bit the agenda, and then hopefully that will leave us with sufficient time for Q&A towards the end of the session. So first of all, to kick things off, I always like to highlight the photo on the top right that shows our facility from an aerial view. On the back here, that's our phase 1 facility, which is a 10,000 metric ton plant that is expected only a couple of weeks from now to be at full utilization for the first time. Then what you can also see on the same picture is our phase 2 expansion. This will be an additional 36 tanks that will add an additional 15,000 tons of capacity once that construction is finalized, bringing Atlantic Sapphire's total annual harvest volume capacity to approximately 25,000 tons. Flipping to the slides here. Atlantic Sapphire was founded in 2010 with the sole ambition to do large-scale salmon farming on land here in the US. However, before doing the large-scale construction project in the US, we spent 10 years doing our proof of concept facility in Denmark, where we built up through several stages what was a 2,400 ton capacity farm. Here, we basically had to develop from scratch the design and the operational procedures in order for us to do the same large scale in the US end market. And why were we so focused on the US market? I'll get back to that. But our ambitions are far beyond phase 1 and phase 2 that we highlighted. On a current plot of land that we already own here in the US, we estimate that we can add approximately 150,000 tons of annual salmon farming volumes. And then we have ambitions beyond that because right here where we are, we see no real limitations of growth other than what we can fund with access to capital. This is another slide that we always highlight as a starting point, and we think it's, although it's familiar to a lot of you, always worth showing again. If you look at this slide, it shows global salmon trade patterns of where salmon is produced and where salmon is consumed globally. What's very interesting to note is that Asia and North America are markets that are today primarily supplied by airborne salmon. If you look at consumption figures in the US, they are 3-4 times as high as what is locally produced. So when the company was founded 10 years ago, this was the solution, the problem that we were trying to fix. This is the reason why we wanted to be in the US in the first place. So if you move your production to the North American market, you get some big advantages. First of all, you will get a much fresher product to the end consumer, thanks to the fact that you have a much shorter value chain. Secondly, you will cut the carbon footprint dramatically by not having to put the fish on an airplane. And third, you get a big cost advantage compared to most of the other salmon in the US market by already being here and not having to pay for expensive air freight. So we always like to repeat that key story as the reason why we chose the US to do our large scale development. The next slide, as another brief introduction, shows a rough schematic of how our facility looks like underneath the roof. Here you can see that points 1, 2, and 3, that is our freshwater stage. And this is where we farm the fish from egg all the way to the smoltification, and approximately 200 grams when we transfer it into our large saltwater grow-out tanks. As most of you are well aware of, the freshwater part of the RAS is being used throughout the industry. The unique part are the large grow-out systems that we have developed. In phase 1 alone, we have a total of 12 independent RAS systems for grow-out, each of them containing 3 tanks that are 1,750 cubic meters in size each. The way our RAS system works is that we, of course, as with most other RAS systems, have the same core technology of mechanical filtration, biofilters, trickling filters, oxygenations, etc., to keep water conditions optimal for the fish all the time. In addition to this, we always highlight that it is crucial to also have access to fresh and saline intake water, and to be able to dispose of treated non-toxic wastewater, because as all of you RAS professionals know, a RAS system isn't a RAS system. It depends a lot on how much water you're able to access and what your actual recirculation degree is. In our case, we have the luxury of having access to a lot of water and being able to dispose sustainably a lot of water, which is a key advantage in how we produce. Going over to why we ended up in South Florida, out of all places in the US, the team spent a total of 3 years traveling through a dozen states trying to find the ideal location to do this. And other than obvious site selection criteria that are listed here, such as labor, logistics, cheap electricity prices, the most important reason why we're in South Florida is due to access to water and the local geology that only exists here. To give you the quick and dirty summary of what I mean by that, if you look at this slide, you'll see what Florida looks like underneath the ground. It's similar to a sandwich where you'll see different water layers, so-called aquifers, that are separated by confining zones of rock that doesn't allow water to penetrate between the different layers. On top, we find the Biscayne aquifer, which is fresh water and ideal for our freshwater part of the production. Call it less than 5% of our total water consumption. Then, at around 1,000 feet below the ground, we have access to the Floridan aquifer. The Floridan aquifer, where we are, is a salt water aquifer that is completely biosecure. This is water that over thousands of years has been mineralized and is completely dead. When I say dead, that means there's no oxygen down there, there's no life, it's never seen the industrial age. And what is so fantastic with this water source is it gives us huge volumes of completely stable water. We always know exactly what to work with, which makes the pre-treatment and dimensioning of our systems much easier, because the water that we take into the farm doesn't fluctuate with seasons or with whatever nature may offer. Then the maybe most important part of why we're here is how we solve what I refer to as the water discharge issue when you want to do large-scale RAS. In South Florida, 3,000 feet below the ground, we find the boulder zone. The boulder zone is a cavernous formation of limestone rock that acts as a natural filter. We can send down large volumes of wastewater where we simply remove solids down into the ground, where it will get filtered through this aquifer for many, many years and end up as clean water back into the ocean. By doing this, we can sustainably use large volumes of water, and thanks to the enormous size of the aquifers of Florida, we can effectively build out as much capacity in a quite small area of land as we would like, and we have the ability to build from a financing point of view. So we think that this is truly unique. This is a key risk mitigant in our production, and thankfully we also were able to get a patent on our way of using the aquifers in Florida to produce fish in a RAS system. Flipping to the operational improvements part, which is what I want to focus a little bit more on. As Jean highlighted in her introduction, we have been through a challenging commissioning phase in phase 1. We were delivered a RAS facility in different stages where things didn't work the way they're supposed to from day one. And if you look at 2020 and 2021, those years, at least until the summer of 2021, were characterized by large commissioning challenges and construction delays that obviously put a big stress on the organization, but also, unfortunately, on the initial batches of fish that we were farming at the time. If you look at the biggest risk improvements, and we use risk as the buzzword here because one of the most important focus areas we have besides productivity, of course, is managing risk and minimizing risk. We are working with technically advanced systems. We're working with biology. So there will always be risk in what we do. So our job as fish farmers is minimizing that risk and also being prepared that something unexpected will happen. Looking at 2021, this is a rough summary of the key learnings that hopefully can be useful for other fish farmers as well. One of the most important changes we made were on the water quality parameters themselves. Obviously, in RAS, there are hundreds of parameters that you can impact, and your job as a fish farmer is constantly fine-tuning all of these to give the fish marginally better conditions every day. However, there were some more significant changes we did that took down the risk on the water chemistry side. Another important change we made was splitting all of our grow-out systems in two. The original design of our phase 1 in Miami had 6 independent grow-out systems. When I say independent, that means they have their own RAS. They're not sharing water or other resources with the neighboring systems. We found a way to split each of those in two, so that we effectively have 12 systems. And why are we doing that? Back to my original comment on this slide, we acknowledge that there will always be risk in what we do. So what's important for us is to minimize the impact of if there is something surprising that happens. Ensure that if something unexpected happens, only a very small part of our biomass would be impacted by it. Another key learning on the design side were the center drains, where we made modifications to the center drains to reduce the risk of smaller mortality, disrupting the flow of the RAS system and new water coming into the tanks. This can be explained simply as installing snorkels in every single tank that allowed us to maintain flow. Also, if there was something or fish that was blocking our original center drain, which used to be simply a hole at the bottom of the tank. On the organizational side, we spent a lot of time finding the ideal way to organize what is truly a very large operation. As we were growing very fast, it of course takes some time to get everything in place and find the best and most effective ways to operate. And what we've done, for example, is on the operational side to introduce each on-growing system has its own manager that is responsible for its own system, and that nothing happens in that specific system without that manager being aware and approving of it. What that drives is accountability, and also that there's no, or minimizing, I would say, the risk that someone else goes in and does something that has negative side effects that that specific person wouldn't be in a position to foresee. So again, we're talking about large complex systems here, and we need to be honest to ourselves that no one can have full overview of everything that is happening in the farm. So we need to have structures in place and oversight and accountability to not allow for errors to happen. And on that note, we also introduced a facilities operation advisory board last year, which is a known, call it layer of bureaucracy in our organization, where every non-routine operation that is to happen needs to go through this advisory board for approval. This also comes from the learning that even the most skilled fish farmer we have will not be able to take into account all of the time, all of the different consequences of doing modifications to these systems. Sometimes what can seem like a very good and efficient fix to one issue may lead to another issue that is not immediately visible. So by having a board with a skilled person from all over organization that can help vet any changes, we minimize the risk of errors. Finally, and this is a topic that is day to day, every day, it's about fine-tuning automation systems and getting better systems to monitor the water conditions, monitor the fish, and being able to efficiently see if something is out of our preferred range. Other risk mitigation focus areas that we are continuously focusing on is building up internal competence. We spend a lot of time and resources in educating our employees, learning them all parts of the business to make them better fish farmers, but also at the same time establishing strict SOPs, standard operating procedures, and importantly, a system to monitor that these are being followed. We are firm believers that following SOPs is the only way to do this. We encourage new ideas on how we can become better, but those ideas are not enforced by the single fish farmer. They're brought into discussion and signed off on by the whole company, so that we know we're not doing anything that can risk the fish or the performance of the fish. Finally, on the technical side, another important part of operating a system like this is making sure that we constantly have redundancy across the board. When I say redundancy, let's use a simple example. We have a lot of pipes and a lot of different pumps and equipment in this farm that always are running. And it will always happen that, for example, a pump breaks down. When I say redundancy, what's important to us is from the time that something like that happens, it takes very little time for us to replace that pump and fix it, so that our most important focus area, the fish, it does not even notice that that pump broke down. Initially, when we started out, we can be honest to say that we had a too slow reaction time when something like this happens. And in order to improve, we just need to have more redundancy across the board so that we can react more efficient and make sure that our fish always has optimal conditions. Then I would just like to take the last part here, spend 5 minutes just on a quick recap on how Atlantic Sapphire is doing today. And if you look at 2022 so far, it's been a much better year for us after huge construction and commissioning issues in 2020 and 2021. 2022 has been a year of stability that has allowed us to finally fine-tune the US operation. We're not there yet, but we're taking large leaps towards where we want to be throughout 2022. We've harvested out the initial batches of fish where we saw a high degree of maturation. And in the batches that we currently have in the farm, we see no signs of anything normal on the early maturation side. Also in 2022, in the first 6 months, we saw significant reductions in cost per kilo, both linked to cost-cutting initiatives we've had, and of course, higher volumes to distribute all the fixed costs on. Our new filleting facility was completed and installed, which we are very excited about, which gives us the foundation to have cost-efficient processing and deliver higher yields and better quality control, which is important for our customers. On the phase 2 construction side, our focus has been on optimizing the project quality and cost. Even though we might sacrifice some of the construction speed, there is no question that construction right now in 2022 is extremely difficult with massive inflation and also large supply chain issues. We're taking account of that by focusing more on value engineering and sacrificing speed. Finally, a last milestone for the year to date has been our financing in June, where we raised $125 million of equity, and we're granted another $100 million of bank debt from DNB. This effectively secures the funding for phase 2, which also was very important for us. On the operational status side, this slide that you can see here shows the new batches of fish that we have in the farm and how that biomass has gradually been growing. In order for us to be at full utilization of phase 1, we estimate that we should have around 4,200 tons of standing biomass in the whole farm. So we expect to get there now in Q4. Another milestone, these are numbers as of end of August. We were at the run rate feeding level of around 28 tons of feed per day. That's around 75% of our full steady state budget for phase 1. So still a few steps to go. How are we going to get there? Through a combination of filling up the farm, getting to full utilization, and getting the growth rates up the last few steps on the ladder to 100% of our budget. On the growth rate side, here with the 28 tons that I referred to on the last slide, and assuming that you didn't have 80% stocked farm, but rather 100% stocked farm, you can simplify the story and say that we were roughly 90% where we want to be in terms of growth rates. Why not 100% yet? Well, because there's still things that we need to fix and we need to improve to really give the fish optimal conditions to deliver the full biological potential. But we feel that we are very close. And jumping to the next slide, on our current operational focus areas as of today, we've identified 3 specific things that we believe will help us get towards that 100% performance and effectively full production and for the first time profitable operations here in the US. The first one is on the temperature side. As some of you might recall, we had an issue with losing our primary energy center, our chiller plant, back in January 2021. As an effect of that, we've been running the farm with temporary external chillers hooked up since then. What we're doing now is by basically pooling together all the chillers, which allows us to not only cut costs and have a more efficient use of them, but also more stable water into each of the separate ongoing systems. And water stability, water temperature stability, that is one thing that we believe is very important for the performance of the fish and getting conditions perfect. Secondly, we've also invested in better lighting. The lights we originally had installed in phase 1, we saw that with the way we operate and with a fully stress test farm, you can say, that they were not delivering enough light for the fish. So also here, the quick and simple fix is getting more lights, which we also think is going to have a very positive effect on the fish performance and appetite, its ability to see the pellets and eat, but also has a positive effect in minimizing risk for early maturation. Third, on the nutrition side, we also discovered certain deficiencies in the diet of the fish. And as soon as we fixed those, we also saw a quite significant uptick in performance. So again, there are always things that can improve. These 3 things are quite significant improvements that we're making, and which we hope to see the effects of in the next weeks and months. Just because they're listed here, I'll also mention the processing as a focus area for the second half of the year. And of course, cost cutting. We have a high fixed cost base, and with inflation throughout the world right now, it's even more important to be as efficient as possible in how much resources we use to farm the fish. Price achievement, we've had consistently stable high price achievement for our fish since we harvested the first fish in September 2020. So I will not spend so much time on that in this presentation. I'd rather go straight to the summary and outlook for what you can expect and what the outside world can follow when it comes to Atlantic Sapphire's developments over the next months. I think, of course, our key focus is on biological performance. In the start of Q3, we saw a solid improvement in our main KPI, the feeding, which is encouraging, but there's still a few steps for us to take to get to where we want to be. And that's something we hope to deliver on in the next weeks and months. On the harvest side, we're expecting to harvest between 800,000 and 1 million fish in the second half of the year, most of that in Q4. So also here you'll see a ramp up in harvest volumes compared to the run rate we've had over the last 2 years. In Denmark, we are initiating a strategic review to find out what is the best future for that facility or that site. Obviously, with our focus being on the US, Denmark is no longer as strategically important for us. So that's why we're evaluating what is the best path forward there. On phase 2 construction, to repeat, the focus is on value engineering, making sure that we get as much bang for the buck on the construction side. More important to us than when the facility is actually ready. On the US demand side, we continue to see strong salmon demand. However, as everyone else, we're closely monitoring what effects inflationary pressure on the US consumer has on spending, and specifically on spending on seafood. We haven't seen any dramatic effects to date, but that is of course something that in today's world is definitely worth following. On our specific offtake, we are going to add additional programs and new customers over the next months as we ramp up harvest volumes. And with that, we also expect to see an increase in price achievement. So that's a little bit the things to follow, the key KPIs that we track internally, and that we think the outside world will be interested in following over the next month. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for the attention, and give the word back to Jean to moderate our Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Karl, for your presentation. There are many eyes on companies like Atlantic Sapphire and your work there, so we appreciate the learnings that you can share with us today. If we could actually go back to the slide with your aquifers, we have some questions here about your wastewater.
Sure.
So can you touch, the question here is, can you touch upon your mechanical filtration solution on your wastewater before injection into the ground, and where does the solids go afterwards?
So absolutely. So when we take our wastewater out of the farm, then as I mentioned in the presentation, what we do is pre-treatment of that water by removing solids. And that's simply running the water through our drum filters, removing all uneaten feed or feces from the fish, so that what's left is completely non-toxic but very nutrient-rich water that is then sent down into the aquifer. What we get out of that process, of course, is sludge from the production. And as of today, our sludge, we remove water, and then it's currently being sent to a landfill. So as we've talked about before, and most of you have probably heard this as well, our ambition for the future is trying to get most value out of everything that comes out of the production. And in Denmark, for example, the sludge that we had from our production, the byproduct there, went to biogas production. We don't have the same opportunity here. Our dream is that in the future we will be able to find a clever way to desalinate the sludge, so we can use it as fertilizer, which would be one great option. That's also something that where we don't have the solution yet, but it's working that we're working on. And there are also other initiatives that we are investigating as we speak to figure out how we can get the most value out of what we truly think is worth something and is not only a waste product. So sludge treatment is important, just like every other byproduct that comes from what is a quite large operation here.
Yes, for sure. Our next question here is, what all-in cost per kilogram of fish produced are you achieving? So I guess they're asking, what is your overall fish cost, and and how close or far is that from your ultimate target?
Sure. So of course, the first thing I need to note when I answer that question is that Atlantic Sapphire is a company that is rigged to grow. So we have an organization here and a lot of call it support functions that we wouldn't have if our plan was to remain a 10,000 ton salmon farming company. So obviously there's a lot of fixed costs in this business that you wouldn't have if you were aiming to stop where we were 1 year ago, so to speak. With that in mind, if you just look at what our fixed cost base was in the first 6 months of this year, to take one step back there, actually, when I talk about cost in land-based, I think it's very interesting to note how big percentage of our costs are very fixed in nature. I like to simplify the world and say that in land-based salmon farming, all costs are fixed except the feed. It's not completely true, but it's not far away from the reality either if you look at the numbers. And if I just use that simplification of the world, our fixed cost base today, or when I say today, the first 6 months of the year, and what we expect in feeding and feed cost when we are at full production in phase 1 next year, would currently indicate that we have a production cost of around $9 per kilo. That is, of course, a very high number. It's a number that we still think is enough to give us a profit, but not a huge one. And there is no doubt that we have a very high fixed cost base. Part of that is because we're rigged to grow. Another part of it is because we still have a job to do on the cost cutting side. To use an example, we're using too much money on electricity. One thing is the electricity price, which is a little bit out of our control. More importantly is how can we efficiently use electricity, which is one of the biggest cost items we have. To use an example again, when we use electricity, the price that we pay is dependent on when we use electricity, because there's a certain off-peak and on-peak price for the power. By, for example, being able to use cool more water when we're on off-peak hours, we can reduce our energy bill. We have not had capacity internally to really focus on those projects through 2020 and 2021, because our primary focus then was getting phase 1 up and running. But right now, with the stability that we currently have, we can finally go and look at all of those different cost-cutting opportunities. And your second part of the question was, where do we expect us to end up? Our long-term ambition has been and continues to be that we want to get down to a production cost that is similar to where the conventional industry is at the moment. Right now, I would say that the typical Norwegian salmon farmer, for example, has a production cost of around $5 per kilo. We think we can get there as well, but that's going to take time. It's going to take more scale, even more than just phase 2, to get those economies of scale. It's also going to require us to become more efficient. And we also think that there are definitely rooms for improvement on the productivity side. How many kilos of output we can get out of the same infrastructure. It's all a volume game. Your cost per kilo is dependent on how many kilos you are able to produce every year. There are so many fixed costs here. So that is the focus area. I think just by bringing phase 2 online, a rough estimate, take it with a pinch of salt, is that we can get our costs down by $2 per kilo simply by doing that. And that is not assuming any productivity increases. Rather, it's just assuming more kilos to distribute the fixed costs on.
Okay. Well, while we're in the cost per kilogram topic, you already have products on the shelves today locally. So can you share a little bit about what the company has learned from initial market research, initial consumer feedback, and how those marketing strategies have come into play?
Sure. Well, that's of course a very interesting topic. We are selling what we believe is a truly unique product with unique product attributes compared to salmon that US consumers have been used to seeing on the shelves. Since we started our first commercial harvest in September 2020, so over 2 years actually, we've seen that consumers are more and more interested in knowing where their food comes from. And of course, for us, when we sell our fish and when we sell our fish at premium prices, then of course we try to highlight those advantages. I think the health focus is very large. When we sell our fish, we highlight that this is a product that is produced in a closed containment system where we have full control of the environment of the fish. For example, we don't use any antibiotics. We don't even vaccinate the fish. The water that we get into the farm has no dioxins, no PCBs, no heavy metals. And those health effects is definitely one point that we highlight. Secondly, by being one of the few US producers of salmon, we also make a point out of that. We're local. It's fresher, thanks to the fact that it's closer to the consumer, and it's made in the USA, which to a lot of consumers is a great added benefit. This is along the lines of the farm-to-table trend that has been going on for years, and something that we also see that our customers value. The sustainability story is of course important. Most important that we eliminate the need for air freight. thereby reducing the carbon footprint of the product significantly. But also to a lot of consumers, it's a great story to tell that by farming in our RAS system in closed containment, we have no impact on the environment around us at all. And we have no impact on wild salmon for those who are very interested in that topic, but also we don't have any wastewater that goes into a river or into the ocean, so that there's no impact on biodiversity at all where we operate. And I think that sustainability argument is also getting more and more traction. So there's a lot of different things that we use in our marketing to highlight the differences. We always do that with a focus on what's good about our product. We never talk negatively about other seafood products and don't think that is good. And thanks to that, an interesting note here at the end is that we actually see that when we do our positive marketing of our product, we see that the whole seafood categories in the stores we're in is actually increasing. People buy more seafood in general, not only our fish, because we highlight some of the benefits. And that is something that we are very proud of, and naturally our customers are also very happy about.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a few questions here about addressing off flavor. Can you give us a little bit of insight on what sort of practices you guys do on the scale that you are on and how you mitigate off flavor?
Sure. That is a big topic, and it's a good question. We could probably spend a 40-minute presentation talking about that topic, but to simplify, we've spent 10 years getting control of off flavor. We had big issues with off flavor when we started out in Denmark, and most important for us is making sure that we have good water quality inside the farm, so that we take or minimize the problem at its root. If we farm with perfect stability in the farm, we see that we're able to have very little adjustment, very little MIB in the water itself, which means that we effectively don't have anything in the fish either. That's an ideal solution. Of course, we need to be realistic that from time to time, we will have instability, we will have adjustment in the water. So we also have capacity to purge the fish. For those of you who are not familiar with what that means simply at the end of the cycle, turning off the feeding, sending new clean makeup water, in our case, fresh well water, into the tanks, so that the adjustment gets diluted out and the fish tastes delicious again. So that's also a tool that we have and that we're also actively using when needed to ensure that whatever leaves our farm always tastes delicious. And it's a very important question, because we know how complicated this is to handle. And there's not one kind of single solution and one quick fix to this. This is a result of hundreds of different things that you've done over time to get more stability into the RAS, which takes down the levels of adjustment, levels of MIBs to a manageable level. It's very expensive to have a lot of those compounds in the water, because the more you have to purge the fish, and the less fish you're able to produce. So it's a big topic for us.
We have some questions here as well about more details on the feed that the facility consumes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I believe you've already mentioned how much the fish consumes in a certain day, but yeah, like what feed do you use? Are you considering protein alternatives in any way? Sure.
No, I would say that our salmon feed is quite similar to what most salmon in the salmon farming world is fed, but there are some differences, some nuances that are worth pointing out. First and foremost, we are very focused on the physical quality of the feed. In a RAS system, what is not eaten and digested by the fish is left for the RAS system to handle, and basically takes capacity from the RAS system from cleaning water that could benefit our performance. So we always want to have very high physical quality, low fat leakage, low breakage, little dust, so that we don't put unnecessary strain on the RAS system just cleaning up feed that hasn't even been eaten. Then on the sustainability side, we also focus on that, and we want to be at the forefront of taking salmon feed into the future. And what I mean by that is that we see the issue that if you farm salmon, but still depend on large volumes of wild fish to feed the fish, then you can argue that it's not sustainable for the simple reason that fisheries globally is not going up. And for that reason, we have actually in 2021 started using an algae-based alternative from one of our partners, Veramaris, to replace 25% of all the fish oil in our feed. We've also taken steps to reduce the fish meal content. So as of today, our salmon feed has only around 15% marine ingredients. So with those steps, we think that we have one of the salmon products in the world with the lowest marine content in order to farm the end product. So that's something we're very proud of, and we have an ambition to go completely out of the ocean over time. But because our primary focus is ensuring the fish welfare and the performance of the fish, then we're not doing this too fast. We take it step by step. We're gradually increasing the amount of alternative ingredients to marine that we're adding to the feed, always monitoring that the fish continues to be happy.
Okay, for sure. And yes, with finite marine resources, I think every aquaculture company is kind of faced with the challenge of being less dependent on these raw materials. A key part of the presentation today has been about the setbacks and the lessons learned from the past 2 years. And a question here is about how much did the fundraising environment change in 2022 versus your previous rounds of funding? How much has it been affected by the setbacks of the operation?
I think that obviously we are, it has an impact. I would say that now that we are in production, that has some big benefits, because a lot of the initial questions that we got from investors and potential investors, they have been addressed and those boxes have been ticked. But obviously with some of the issues we've had here in the US, especially on phase 1 commissioning, that has kind of triggered new questions. So I wouldn't say that it's been a problem, so to speak, to be out and engage with investors. I would not say that there's a lack of interest in any way. And I think the $125 million that we raised in June, for example, speaks for itself, that there is still significant interest. The issues that we're solving with our way of producing salmon is something that resonates well with investors. But of course, as investors get more and more educated, they will ask better and better questions about how we're handling risk, which was one key part of this presentation, and also the economics of what we do. And we've always been very honest and very clear that what we do is difficult. These are technically advanced systems. We're working with biology, and this has not been done before at this scale. So we've always been very clear that there will be challenges ahead, and our job is to handle those challenges, tackle those challenges as best as we can. And that, of course, is a big topic that is where I think that to our benefit, investors are much more educated now. I do, of course, recognize that if you look at the financial markets in general right now, it's extremely difficult to raise money for land-based projects for many reasons. Other than Atlantic Sapphire specific reasons, I think that there's no question that high capex figures with inflation, electricity prices in Europe, people questioning demand for salmon now that we are in a high inflation environment and more shaky global economy, all of that also has a big impact on capital raising for us and for all our companies. So we are just very happy that we have the capital that we need to deliver both phase 1 and phase 2, and that we can do just that. So It's a big topic. RAS and land-based salmon farming, especially at commercial scale, is extremely capital intensive. So you need to have a supportive investor base, and that's something that you build up over time by getting the right people in, educating, and building trust. And we definitely feel that we have a very supportive investor base ourselves.
Now, oxygen supply was a key factor in the mass mortalities last year. So there's a question here about, with the facility expansion, what is being done to mitigate the oxygen availability risk?
So we actually, just to clarify, we did not have any mortality linked to the lack of oxygen. So what we did have was one event where, due to a sudden surge in COVID cases here in South Florida, there was a general lack of oxygen in the market. So what happened in our case, just to recap, is that suddenly we got a force majeure notification from our oxygen supplier that they could no longer guarantee the normal volumes of oxygen deliveries. What we did as a consequence of that was we took down our temperatures in the farm. We took down the feeding level to basically take our oxygen consumption to a minimum, just to be sure that we never put the fish at risk. It turns out that even though we were warned that there was a risk we would not get oxygen delivered, we ended up getting the oxygen we needed. And after 2 weeks of going basically slow pace in production, we had secured all the necessary backup sources of oxygen to go back into full normal operation. So we never killed fish in what was popularly referred to as the oxygen crisis, but it did set back production by 2-3 weeks because we, in abundance of caution, took down our production and our oxygen consumption because we didn't want to risk the fish. Oxygen and access to electricity to run the farm, those are the two critical components that we always need in order to keep the fish alive. So that's, of course, where we're not taking any shortcuts and not taking any unnecessary risks. And to answer the question, I forgot that we are also planning to have on-site oxygen production from phase 2. Exactly what that's going to look like is not yet decided, but it makes sense not only from a risk point of view, but also from a financial point of view to produce oxygen on site. So that is going to be the medium and long-term solution to that topic.
Okay, we are coming up to our time here, so I'll thank Karl quickly for sharing this time with us and being open to answering all of our questions here. So thank you again for being a part of our RAS Virtual Summit.
Thank you so much.